1 year before and after stroke. Viscoplastopology analysis of pre-stroke and post-stroke dynamics. Number 1693. BPT 138. June 21, 2026. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Stroke and Viscoplastopology. Preface for readers: eat more protein and fresh vegetables. Eat less red meat and processed food. Exercise daily. Walk as much as your physical condition allows. Drink sufficient water every day. Sleep adequately and consistently. Protect your emotional health. Avoid unnecessary stress and conflicts. Most importantly, continue learning. Knowledge is one of the most powerful tools available for protecting health and extending life. Introduction. June 21, 2026 marks the first anniversary of my hemorrhagic pontine stroke. 1 year ago, on the morning of June 21, 2025, my life changed suddenly. The stroke occurred without warning and could easily have ended my life. According to my neuroscience physician at Stanford University, the mortality rate for this type of stroke is extremely high. By all practical standards, I was fortunate to survive. During the past year, I have spent more than 5,000 hours reviewing my personal biomedical data and studying neuroscience, stroke recovery, pathophysiology of stroke with related metabolic conditions, mathematics, physics, and engineering principles. My goal was not simply to understand what happened to me on that particular day. Instead, I wanted to understand the entire process that led to that event and after that event. Engineers rarely study only the moment when a bridge collapses. They study the months or years of stress accumulation that occurred beforehand. Similarly, I became increasingly interested in the trajectory leading to the stroke and the recovery process afterward. Rather than the stroke itself, this investigation eventually led me to examine the concept of viscoplastic energy accumulation and the resulting topological changes within my biological systems. Observations. Recently, I reviewed a 2-year chart containing two risk indicators, TSI2, derived primarily from two blood pressure variables, PP and SBP, TSI3B, derived from two blood pressures variables and one glucose variable. The chart covered the period from June 21, 2024 through June 21, 2026 and included the date of my stroke of June 21, 2025. Several observations immediately became apparent. First, both curves followed nearly identical trajectories. The correlation coefficient was approximately 0.91, with an R-squared value of approximately 0.83. This means that more than 80% of the variation in one curve could be explained by the other. Second, both indicators rose steadily during the months preceding the stroke. The highest values occurred near the stroke period. TSI to peak approximately equals 123.7, TSI3B peak approximately equals 107.53. Immediately after the stroke, both curves reversed direction and began to decline. Fourth, the decline continued for nearly an entire year without returning to the previous elevated levels. By June 2026, both indicators had stabilized within a much lower and narrower range. On the morning of the first anniversary of my stroke, June 21, 2026, my measurements were fasting glucose, 99 mg VL, average blood pressure, approximately 111/64 mmHg MAP, 79 TSI2, 97.6 TSI3B, 81.6. These values fit naturally within the stable post-stroke plateau shown on the chart. Data interpretation. What fascinated me most was not the occurrence of the stroke itself. Rather, it was the shape of the trajectory. The chart did not resemble a random event. Instead, it resembled the behavior of many physical systems studied in engineering and physics. In classical viscoplastic materials, stress is applied continuously over time. Internal strain accumulates gradually. Damage develops silently and often remains invisible. Eventually, a critical threshold is reached, and failure occurs. After failure, the accumulated energy is released, and the system settles into a new equilibrium state. When viewed from this perspective, my chart appeared to tell a remarkably similar story. The first phase was energy accumulation. During the year before the stroke, the TSI2 and TSI3B indicators climbed steadily. Physiological stress was increasing, even though many individual glucose and blood pressure measurements still appeared acceptable when viewed separately. The second phase was criticality. Near June 21, 2025, the accumulated physiological stress reached its highest observed level. The system entered a Vulnerable state. The third phase was failure. The hemorrhagic stroke represented the observable event. However, the event itself may have been only the final manifestation of a much longer accumulation process. The fourth phase was energy release and adaptation after my stroke. Following the stroke, both TSI2 and TSI3B curves declined rapidly. The physiological system appeared to move into a new operating regime. The fifth phase was post-stroke stabilization. For 1 year after my stroke, the indicators remained relatively stable without returning to the pre-stroke levels. This pattern strongly resembles many natural systems, including material fatigue, structural failure, and even earthquake mechanics. In all of these cases, the visible event is only one moment within a much larger trajectory. A possible viscoplastic view of stroke. Traditional medicine often focuses on the event itself. A stroke occurs on a specific day, at a specific time, and treatment begins afterward. The viscoplastic perspective asks a different question: what trajectory was developing before the event occurred? My TSI models are relatively simple. They are based primarily on interactions among blood pressure, pulse pressure, and glucose. Yet when these variables are combined multiplicatively, the resulting trajectory appears to capture information that may not be visible when each variable is examined independently. This observation does not prove prediction, however. It suggests that the interaction among multiple physiological forces may provide useful information regarding the accumulation of biological stress. From this viewpoint, the stroke was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a long process involving continuous stress accumulation, increasing vulnerability, and eventual system failure. VMT physical viscoplastic energy analysis. One interesting finding emerged when comparing the TSI3B time domain area with the VMT stress-strain interaction energy. The area under the TSI3B curve became noticeably smaller after the stroke, indicating a lower overall stroke risk level during the recovery period. However, the cumulative VMT energy showed a nearly equal distribution, 49% before the stroke and 51% after the stroke. This apparent discrepancy occurs because the two measurements represent different physical quantities. The TSI3B area measures the magnitude of risk over time, whereas VMT energy measures the cumulative interaction between stress and strain within the physiological system. Therefore, the smaller post-stroke TSI3B area reflects reduced risk, while the nearly equal VMT energy suggests that substantial adaptive and recovery-related work continued after the stroke. In other words, the pre-stroke energy primarily represents stress accumulation, whereas the post-stroke energy primarily represents system reorganization and stabilization. This finding demonstrates that risk magnitude and stress-strain interaction energy describe two different dimensions of physiological behavior and should not be expected to produce identical results. Topological observations from the 3D trajectory and 2D radar charts. The 3D topological trajectory chart and the 2D radar chart provide two complementary views of the same physiological system. The 3D scattering chart focuses on system evolution, using EEG and SBP as the input stresses and TSI3B as the output response. The trajectory reveals a clear progression from 2024 Q2 through the stroke quarter and into the post-stroke recovery period. The path is continuous rather than random, indicating that the stroke occurred within an evolving physiological process rather than as an isolated event. The 2D radar chart focuses on system geometry. By displaying TSI3B, PP, and SBP simultaneously, it allows direct comparison of the relative size and shape of the physiological state. The geometric area expanded from 2024 Q2 to 2024 Q4, remained elevated during the stroke quarter off to 9 to 5 Q3. And then contracted significantly by 2026 Q2. The most notable finding is that EEG increased by approximately 10% after the stroke, while SBP decreased by approximately 11% and TSI3B decreased by approximately 13%. In addition, PP changed relatively little throughout the observation period. This pattern suggests that mechanical stress, particularly SBP, exerted a stronger influence on stroke-related risk than glucose during this period. Together, the 3D scattering trajectory chart and the 2D radar chart provide both a geometric view and an evolutionary view of the system. They illustrate not only how the physiological state changed over time, but also how the relative balance among the major variables shifted before and after the stroke. Conclusion: 1 year after my stroke, I have come to view the event differently. The stroke itself lasted only a moment. The trajectory leading to it lasted much longer. The most important lesson from this experience is that health should not be viewed as a collection of isolated measurements. Instead, health is a dynamic process that evolves continuously over time. The chart reviewed on this anniversary appears to illustrate a complete viscoplastic cycle. Accumulation gives criticality, gives failure, gives recovery, gives stabilization. Whether this interpretation ultimately proves useful for future stroke research remains unknown. However, my personal data observations are sufficiently intriguing to justify continued investigation. As a mathematician, engineer, and medical researcher, I have learned that nature often leaves clues long before a visible event occurs. The challenge is learning how to recognize those clues. 1 year after surviving a potentially fatal stroke, I remain grateful for life, for learning, and for the opportunity to continue exploring these unanswered questions. Knowledge is the ultimate power for everyone, at least for my survival. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.